Hey guys, tonight we begin with the bizarre and often ridiculous final moments of those who were supposed to be the most dignified humans alive. Royalty, kings, queens, emperors. Their lives were filled with ceremony, power, and gold-threaded robes. But their deaths? Well, let's just say some of them would rather be forgotten. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. King Adolf Fredrik of Sweden. Death by desert. Of all the ways for a monarch to exit this world, in battle, by betrayal, or on a velvet deathbed surrounded by sobbing nobles, King Adolf Fredrik of Sweden chose desert. It was February 1771, a chilly evening, and Adolf Fredrik, like many of us after a stressful day of doing absolutely nothing important, decided to treat himself. Except his idea of a treat was a culinary suicide mission. The royal menu that night was ambitious. It began with lobster, then caviar, then sauerkraut, smoked herring and champagne. Not one glass, no, several. Enough to make even the royal wig feel dizzy, but none of that killed him. What did him in? 14 servings of semla. Now, if you're not Scandinavian, semla is a sweet roll made of wheat, cardamom and almond paste, topped with whipped cream and floating in warm milk. It's delicious. It's heavy. It's the kind of dessert you eat one of and say, "Whew, that's enough." Adolf Fredrik had 14. That's not dessert. That's a sugar-based assassination. His servants must have been horrified. Somewhere between roll number 10 and 13, someone surely said, "Your Majesty, perhaps a digestive walk?" But the king waved them off, spoon in hand, cream on his lips, determined to go out in style. And he did. Later that evening, he complained of stomach cramps, which progressed to pain, then collapse, and then the official cause of death, digestive problems. That's putting it mildly. The man ate himself into oblivion. His legacy? A relatively peaceful reign, some administrative reforms, and the title of the king who ate himself to death. You've got to hand it to him. There are worse ways to go. He wasn't assassinated. He didn't fall off a horse. He didn't die of plague or a cursed goblet. He was taken out by pastry. And honestly, that's kind of majestic in its own way. So next time you reach for a second slice of cake and hear that little voice in your head say, "Why not?" just remember King Adolf Fredrik. And maybe, just maybe, put the spoon down. King George II, the royal Lou. Exit royalty tends to imagine its final moments with a bit of ceremony. A deathbed farewell, a fading breath whispered in Latin, perhaps a full orchestra humming gently in the background. But King George II of Great Britain, he died on the toilet. Yes, you read that correctly. It was the morning of October 25th, 1760. King George II, in his late 70s, woke up feeling a bit off. Still, he followed his usual morning routine. Some light conversation, maybe a touch of royal grumbling, and then, as all men must, a visit to the privy. Except he didn't return. Moments later, servants rushed in and found the monarch slumped over the chamber pot. He had suffered a sudden aortic aneurysm, a rupture of the body's largest artery, and died instantly. So yes, technically he died of natural causes. But the location? Unforgiving. Let's take a moment to imagine it. The King of England, Elector of Hanover, defender of the faith, meeting his end not in bed, not on horseback, but half-sitting, mid-business, pants at royal half-mast. Hardly the portrait you want framed over the fireplace. To be fair, the chamber pot itself was no peasant's bucket. We're talking porcelain, possibly gold-rimmed, and surely flanked by servants trained in the art of not reacting. But still, it's the kind of death that gets whispered about in footnotes, not sung in ballads. The physicians wrote it up respectfully. The public was told he died of a heart problem, which was technically true, but the full story was preserved, thanks to court gossip and a few very honest palace attendants who couldn't let it go. And neither has history. Because for all his accomplishments, his wars, his reforms, his reign over an empire, George II is remembered most clearly for being the only British monarch to die on the toilet, a legacy no one asked for and no one has matched. He ruled an empire and died like a man. Sigurd the Mighty, bitten by a dead man. Some royal deaths are tragic, others are absurd. And then there's Sigurd the Mighty, who managed to die from something even Shakespeare couldn't have invented, a bite from a man who was already dead. Let's rewind to the 9th century. Sigurd Eysteinsson, better known as Sigurd the Mighty, was the Earl of Orkney, a Viking leader, fierce warrior, and all-around Norse tough guy. He spent most of his life raiding, conquering, and terrorising the northern British Isles. Then one day, he defeated his Scottish enemy, a rival chieftain named Mael Brigte. In a move that screamed Viking confidence and questionable hygiene, Sigurd tied the man's severed head to his saddle as a trophy of war. Now, this was a common practice in Viking circles. Brutal, yes, but considered a solid day's work. The problem? Mael Brigte's head still had teeth. As Sigurd rode home in triumph, the head bounced around, as severed heads tend to do when tied to saddles. At some point during the bumpy ride, one of the dead man's teeth scraped Sigurd's leg, a minor cut. Nothing to worry about. If you're not living in the 9th century with zero antibiotics and a complete disregard for infection control. The wound became infected. Fast. And just like that, the victorious Viking, who had slain dozens, conquered territories, and taken down a warlord, died from a scratch. Not just any scratch, a posthumous bite. That's not just ironic, that's cosmic slapstick. Imagine being remembered as the war hero who was taken down not by an ambush or a blade, but by a mouth that wasn't even moving anymore. Historians don't know if Sigurd's men laughed, cried, or just quietly untied the head and walked away. Probably all three. Sigurd's story is now a legend, and honestly, it deserves to be. Not because of the conquests, but because he might be the only Viking in history who lost a duel to dental hygiene. Crown Prince Sado. Death by rice chest. There are royal deaths that make you chuckle. And then there are those that make you slowly put down your chopsticks. Enter Crown Prince Sado of Korea, heir to the throne of the Joseon dynasty in the 18th century. A young man born into privilege, groomed for power, and eventually remembered as the prince who died inside a box. Not metaphorically, literally. Sado had issues. Mental health, violent outbursts, erratic behaviour. Call it what you will, but the court described him as dangerously unpredictable. He was known to execute servants on a whim, and was rumoured to wander the palace at night with a sword, muttering to himself. As you can imagine, this made him unpopular. Now his father, King Yongjo, was a Confucian monarch, calm, composed, and painfully concerned with appearances. Executing one's own son would have been politically messy and spiritually scandalous. But leaving him alive, that was even riskier. So the king came up with a creative solution. He had Sado placed inside a large wooden rice chest, the kind normally used to store grain. It was mid-July, in Korea, which, for the record, is not a pleasant climate for enclosed spaces. There was no ventilation, no water, and no hope of a quick end. Sado survived for 8 agonizing days. No trial, no blade, just a slow, sealed descent into history as one of the most uncomfortable royal demises ever recorded. It's the kind of death that makes you appreciate exile, or even decapitation, as a kind option. The official records, cleaned up for posterity, state that Prince Sado passed away due to divine judgment, which is poetic, but let's be honest, he was rice-boxed to death. Ironically, his son, Jongjo, would go on to become one of Korea's most celebrated rulers. The family never publicly spoke of the box incident, but historians never forgot. It's a tale of palace politics, mental illness, and tragic cruelty, wrapped in wood and sealed with silence. So next time you're complaining about tight spaces or summer heat, just remember Crown Prince Sado. And be thankful no one's solving family drama with furniture. King Martin of Aragon, killed by laughter. If you've ever been told that laughter is the best medicine, allow us to introduce you to the one man in history who quite literally overdosed on it. King Martin of Aragon. The year was 1410. Martin, nearing the end of his reign and battling digestive issues, because no royal story is complete without gastrointestinal drama, had spent the day in bed. Not from injury, but from chronic flatulence and indigestion. The kind of royal wind that clears out courtiers. That evening, he demanded the presence of his personal jester. His request? A joke. Something light, something funny, anything to lift his bloated spirits. The jester delivered. The joke, as preserved in court accounts, went something like this. "Why did you take so long to arrive?" the king asked. The jester replied, "Because I saw a young deer hanging from a fig tree by its tail, and I had to wonder if it was an act of divine punishment." Now, maybe it was the timing. Maybe it was the delirium. Maybe it was the fact that the king hadn't laughed in weeks because he was too busy digesting a goose. But whatever the reason, Martin burst into hysterical laughter. And he didn't stop. Within moments, he was gasping, clutching his stomach, and finally, collapsing. The official cause of death? Indigestion and uncontrollable laughter. Yes, King Martin of Aragon literally laughed himself to death. There's something both tragic and deeply undignified about it. Monarchs are supposed to die heroically, on the battlefield, in a marble hall, or at least during a dramatic monologue. Martin, he met his end with a joke about a deer and a fig tree ringing in his ears. The succession crisis that followed his death plunged the Crown of Aragon into a political mess, but no one could discuss it without stifling a grim chuckle. His advisors must have struggled to write that report with a straight face. Your Majesty has passed, while laughing, extremely hard. In the end, Martin's death became legend, proof that yes, humour can kill. So laugh wisely, guys, especially after dinner. Emperor Qin Shi Huang, poisoned by immortality. If ever there was a man determined not to die, it was Emperor Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of a unified China, and the kind of ruler who didn't just dream of immortality, he demanded it. Ruling in the 3rd century BCE, Qin Shi Huang was a powerhouse. He standardized Chinese currency, measurements, and writing. He built roads, walls, and armies. He even commissioned the legendary Terracotta Army, a life-sized battalion of clay soldiers designed to protect him in the afterlife. Although, as it turns out, he wasn't exactly planning on using them. You see, Qin Shi Huang had no intention of dying. He was obsessed with the idea of living forever, and he tasked his court alchemists and physicians with delivering that dream. Their solution? Mercury pills. Yes, really. Tiny, shimmering, toxic capsules that were marketed as elixirs of immortality. The science behind it? Non-existent. But it had a shiny glow, and in ancient China, shininess often implied power. The emperor, convinced he was drinking life itself, began taking these mercury-based treatments daily. Not occasionally. Daily. The result? His health began to fail. He became paranoid, erratic, and prone to long absences from the court. On one of these trips, a secretive inspection of Eastern territories where he hoped to find more magical life-extending ingredients, he collapsed and died. Poisoned, ironically, by the very thing he believed would make him eternal. The court panicked. His death was hidden for days to prevent political instability. During that time, to keep the ruse going, his entourage reportedly travelled with a wagon of rotting fish to mask the smell of his rapidly decomposing body. Yes, The emperor who feared death so deeply ended up fermenting next to seafood. To this day, Qin Shi Huang's tomb remains unopened, a literal mountain of secrets. Some scholars believe it may be surrounded by rivers of liquid mercury. Fitting, really. The man wanted to be preserved forever, and in a way he is, not as an immortal legend, but as a cautionary tale about trusting quack science and glowing pills. Pope John XII, a heavenly scandal. The papacy has seen its fair share of drama, political intrigue, religious reform, crusades, and schisms. But few popes ever reached the level of papal chaos achieved by Pope John XII. Born Octavianus, he became pope in 955 AD at just 18 years old. Now becoming the spiritual leader of millions before you're old enough to rent a chariot? Not ideal. And the result? Even less ideal. John XII quickly became known less for sermons and more for scandal. His papal palace reportedly resembled less a seat of Christendom and more a Roman frat house. He gambled. He drank. He allegedly ordained a 10-year-old as bishop. He blessed a man's mistress. He even raised toasts to the devil during Mass. It's no surprise, then, that his death was equally unorthodox. According to multiple chroniclers, Pope John XII died of a stroke. But not during prayer, not at the altar. No, he reportedly suffered that stroke while in bed with a married woman. Let that sink in. The Pope died, mid-affair, with someone else's wife. That's not just scandalous. That's a moral black hole. Now, to be fair, the Vatican never released an official statement confirming this account. Possibly because, back then, official statements were written by monks who preferred not to die of embarrassment. But the rumour took on a life of its own. Even centuries later, historians couldn't quite agree whether it was truth or a very juicy smear campaign. But let's say, for a moment, it was true. Imagine being the priest assigned to write the eulogy. Here lies Pope John XII, shepherd of the faithful, vicar of Christ, and frequent visitor of marital bedrooms. His death marked the end of one of the most infamously unpapal papacies in history. He reigned for just under a decade, and in that short time he managed to blur nearly every line between sacred and profane. And so, Pope John XII joins our list not just for how he died, but for how spectacularly he ignored the job description. He came, he sinned, he stroked out. And history never forgot. King Alexander of Greece. Monkey business. Royal duties can be dangerous. War, assassination plots, the occasional poisoned goblet. But King Alexander of Greece? He was killed by a monkey. Yes, a monkey. It was 1920. Greece was balancing on the edge of political turmoil, and Alexander, a young and relatively inexperienced king, had been placed on the throne while his father was exiled. He wasn't exactly in charge, more like a placeholder in a crown. So imagine the surprise when the news broke. The king had been attacked in the royal gardens by monkeys. Here's how it happened. One afternoon, Alexander was walking through the royal estate with his beloved dog. Suddenly, a Barbary macaque, a type of monkey known for being both clever and incredibly short-tempered, appeared. It belonged to a palace worker who apparently didn't see the problem in letting monkeys roam free near royalty. Naturally, the dog and monkey started fighting, and, like any loyal pet owner, Alexander tried to break it up. That's when a second monkey appeared. The two monkeys, not thrilled about royal interference, turned on Alexander and bit him, repeatedly. On the leg. The wounds didn't seem serious at first. He was patched up. No big deal. But days later, infection set in, then gangrene, then sepsis. Within 3 weeks, the King of Greece was dead, from a monkey bite. The fallout was immense. His death triggered a constitutional crisis, a return of his father to the throne, and helped push Greece into further instability. So yes, a monkey attack led to geopolitical chaos. The press at the time didn't know what to do with it. Bitten by a monkey didn't quite fit the traditional royal obituary format. So it was softened, vague phrases like an unfortunate injury or sudden illness used instead. But the truth? It couldn't be covered up. Alexander's reign had been short and largely uneventful, but his death? Unforgettable. He may have worn a crown, but he was ultimately taken down by two small primates who never even got names in the history books. And that's how you become the answer to the strangest trivia question in royal history. Which king was killed by a monkey fight? King Charles II of Navarre. Death by candle. When you think of royal death, you might imagine swords, poison, or at the very least, a dramatic fainting spell after a scandalous banquet. But King Charles II of Navarre, he went out in a way that was both absurd and slightly flammable. Let's set the stage. It's the late 14th century, and Charles II, also known as Charles the Bad, yes, that was his official nickname, wasn't doing so great. He was sick, very sick, possibly suffering from some degenerative illness brought on by a lifetime of political scheming, betrayal, and general unpleasantness. His doctors, equipped with the finest medieval understanding of medicine, which is to say none, came up with a cutting-edge treatment. Wrap the king from head to toe in linen soaked in brandy. That's right, brandy bandages, because when in doubt, marinate the monarch. The idea was to warm his body, draw out the illness, and possibly pickle him into health. It might have even worked, if the final step hadn't involved sewing him into the linen cocoon and leaving a servant to snip the thread. Enter the candle. The servant, working late by flickering candlelight, leaned in to make the final cut, and then, as court historians describe with both horror and dark amusement, the flame touched the linen. Now remember, the king was soaked in alcohol. He went up like a torch. The servant panicked. There was screaming, chaos, probably a few nobles fainting in the corridor. But by the time they extinguished the king, it was too late. Charles II died in one of the most undignified ways possible, accidentally barbecued by his own nurse. The irony was thick. A man who spent his entire life plotting others' downfalls, poisoning rivals, switching alliances, betraying kings, was ultimately undone by his own drip-dry bandage and one inattentive assistant. And so Charles the Bad, who had once ruled with fire and fear, met his end as firewood. Let it be a lesson. Never mix royal treatments with open flame, especially if your nickname is already the Bad. King Edmund II, death on the privy. Some royal deaths are dramatic, some are symbolic. And then there's King Edmund II of England, who allegedly met his end in the most vulnerable position a man can be in, sitting on the toilet. Known as Edmund Ironside, because the second just wasn't intimidating enough, he reigned for only 7 months in 1016. His nickname came from his battlefield grit and refusal to yield to Danish invaders, particularly King Canute the Great, who was breathing down England's neck at the time. Edmund fought like a lion, enduring defeat, betrayal, and political chaos. He was everything you'd expect from a tough Anglo-Saxon king, until the very end, when all that martial glory was overshadowed by what happened in the privy. According to a persistent and suspiciously detailed medieval rumour, Edmund was assassinated while using the toilet. How? A would-be killer, knowing the king's schedule and digestive reliability, hid beneath the wooden seat. And when Edmund sat down, surprise dagger. From below. Gruesome? Yes. Dignified? Not remotely. The official record is murky. Some sources say he died of wounds after battle. Others mention an unnamed private treachery. But a few chroniclers, clearly blessed with imagination, describe the whole scenario in remarkable detail, right down to the killer hiding in the cesspit and striking upward. It's the kind of story that feels like political slander, and yet it's stuck. Because nothing erodes a legacy like death by outhouse ambush. Imagine the scene. Edmund, perhaps humming a victory tune, sitting down after a long campaign, thinking he's finally earned a quiet moment, and then betrayal from below. It's not the stuff of royal murals. It's the stuff of cautionary tavern tales. To be fair, if the assassination tale is true, it was a cunning move. A king is never more defenceless than mid-privy. No armour, no guards, no sword. Just linen, gravity, and unfortunate trust in 11th century plumbing. So whether fact or folklore, Edmund II's death reminds us that even iron-sided kings have soft spots, especially when seated. King Henry I, too many eels. Of all the fatal indulgences in royal history, King Henry I of England may take the prize for the most slippery. Because in 1135, the king who had ruled for over 3 decades, survived war, political turmoil, and rebellious barons, was finally defeated by, wait for it, a plate of lampreys. If you're not familiar, lampreys are jawless, eel-like fish with a mouth that looks like it belongs in a medieval torture chamber. They were considered a delicacy back then. Today, we'd probably call them nightmare noodles. Henry I, however, loved them. He was known to be absolutely obsessed. His court physicians, who understood very little about medicine but a great deal about guessing, had repeatedly warned him against eating so many of them. They were considered rich food, heavy on the digestion, light on survivability. Did Henry listen? Of course not. He was a king. And what's the point of being monarch if you can't defy every medical warning in existence? So during a visit to Normandy, Henry sat down to a grand meal and consumed a surfeit of lampreys, meaning he ate way too many of these slippery, slimy medieval sea worms, not fried, not dipped in anything respectable, likely just boiled and arranged in a grim little pile. Shortly after, he fell violently ill. Abdominal pain, vomiting, fever, the full royal digestive meltdown. Within days, he was dead. The official cause? Food poisoning. His body was embalmed and sent back to England in the winter cold, and there are horrifying details about the journey that we won't get into here. Let's just say, preservation was not a strong suit in 12th century Europe. Historians agree he was a capable and often ruthless ruler. But none of that mattered when his love for a grotesque fish dinner landed him 6 feet under. It's said his doctors had begged him to avoid the dish. His response: "I'd rather die than give up lampreys." Well, mission accomplished. King James II of Scotland, blown up by cannon kings, have died in battle. Kings have died of illness. But King James II of Scotland? He died by standing too close to his own cannon. It was 1460. James was 29 years old, ambitious, and known for 2 things: a famously short temper and a deep love of artillery. This was the golden age of cannon warfare. By golden, we mean wildly unpredictable and prone to spontaneous combustion. At the time, James was laying siege to Roxburgh Castle, a stronghold still occupied by the English. Determined to show off his shiny new cannons, James ordered a demonstration, and naturally wanted a front row seat. Because what could possibly go wrong when standing a few feet from a 15th century cast iron powder tube packed with explosives? Plenty. As the cannon was being fired, it exploded, instantly, violently, spectacularly. A piece of the barrel tore through James's thigh, severing his leg, and according to some reports, part of his torso. The blast was so intense that it killed him almost instantly. His attendants, probably still trying to process the phrase, "Your Majesty just detonated," fled in shock. The king's death threw the Scottish army into temporary chaos, but to their credit, they regrouped and eventually captured the castle. In fact, they later renamed it James's Castle, perhaps as an ironic tribute to the king who donated his limbs to the cause. It was a deeply Scottish end, dramatic, loud, and involving at least one piece of medieval technology failing in the most catastrophic way possible. The ironic twist? James had been a huge advocate for modernising Scotland's artillery. He loved cannons, loved the sound, the smoke, the firepower. He just didn't love basic safety distance. Today, James II is remembered less for his politics and more for being one of the few monarchs in history blown up by his own enthusiasm. Emperor Elagabalus. Too weird to live. If the Roman Empire ever needed a poster child for maybe let's tone it down, it would be Emperor Elagabalus. Born Varius Avitus Bassianus, which already sounds like a spell, he became emperor in 218 AD at just 14 years old. That's right, a teenage emperor. Combine that with near unlimited power, vast wealth, and a complete disregard for anything resembling restraint,